Charles Mills Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His arrival into the world was far from stable or ordinary. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was just 16 years old when she gave birth. Kathleen was young, reckless, and already struggling to take care of herself, let alone an infant. Manson's biological father, Colonel Walker Scott, was never part of the picture. He vanished before Charles was even born, leaving Kathleen to fend for herself. What followed was a childhood defined by abandonment, instability, and deep emotional scars. From his earliest days, Manson was deprived of the warmth and structure most children rely on. Kathleen's teenage years were consumed by alcohol, wild nights, and fleeting relationships. Rather than focusing on her son, she spent her time drifting from one man to another, often leaving Charles in the care of relatives or strangers. This sense of neglect would follow him throughout his life, shaping his hunger for control and attention in destructive ways. Stories from his childhood describe a boy who never felt wanted. At one point, Kathleen allegedly tried to trade her son for a pitcher of beer at a local bar. Though the deal never went through and Charles was returned, the memory of being treated as disposable was seared into his young mind. He began to understand, even as a child, that love and loyalty could not be trusted and survival meant manipulation. When Charles was just 5 years old, Kathleen was sentenced to prison for armed robbery. She had joined her brother in attempting to rob a man by hitting him over the head with a bottle of ketchup filled with salt. The robbery failed, and Kathleen was caught. She was sent to prison, leaving Charles behind once again. During those years, he lived with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. Though they provided shelter, Charles never felt at home. His uncle was strict, his aunt cold. The boy felt like an unwanted burden, shuttled between households, never truly belonging anywhere. When Kathleen was finally released, Charles clung to the hope that life would change, that his mother would finally give him the love he craved. But Kathleen quickly slipped back into her old habits. She drank heavily, partied late, and engaged in reckless behavior. Stability never came, and Charles never found the maternal figure he longed for. Instead, he grew up internalizing rejection. Each disappointment planted seeds of bitterness and mistrust. By the time Charles reached elementary school age, he was already displaying troubling behavior. Teachers described him as withdrawn, manipulative, and prone to sudden outbursts. He struggled academically and socially, often lashing out when he didn't get his way. He learned to lie to avoid punishment and discovered that creating stories or manipulating others could provide temporary advantages. These small acts of control gave him comfort in a world where he felt powerless. Manson's sense of abandonment soon transformed into defiance. By the time he was 8 years old, he was already skipping school, stealing food, and running away from home. He began spending time on the streets, surviving by conning people or rummaging through garbage. Though still just a child, Charles was quickly learning that manipulation and theft were tools for survival. When his mother briefly attempted to remarry, Charles hoped it would mean stability. Instead, it brought more conflict. Kathleen's new husband had little patience for her son, often treating him as an obstacle in their relationship. Once again, Charles found himself unwanted. By the age of 10, he had been sent to multiple foster homes, none of which offered real affection. His loneliness only deepened. Charles's first serious run in with the law came when he was just 13 years old. He was caught stealing a bicycle, a crime that seemed petty but revealed his growing pattern of delinquency. Rather than simply punishing him, the juvenile court sent him to a reform school. It was here that Charles first encountered the cold, institutional environment that would later define much of his life. Reform school was supposed to teach discipline and values, but instead, it exposed him to physical abuse, bullying, and a cycle of violence that hardened him further. At the school, Manson quickly realized that brute strength alone would not allow him to survive. Instead, he learned to manipulate others, to charm, deceive, and control weaker boys. He played the role of a victim when it suited him, only to turn around and exploit others when the opportunity arose. These early lessons in manipulation would later define the way he built and controlled his infamous family. Despite multiple attempts to run away from the reform school, Charles was always caught and brought back. Each escape was fueled by a desperate desire for freedom, but he never found it waiting for him outside. His mother had no interest in taking him back, and the streets offered nothing but hunger and danger. So he would be returned, angrier and more mistrustful than before. By the time he turned 14, Charles had already spent more time in institutions than in a stable home. Each year stripped away more of his innocence and reinforced the belief that he could rely only on himself. He began to see authority figures not as protectors, but as enemies. To survive, he believed he needed to outsmart them, to bend rules rather than follow them. The scars of his childhood were clear. He carried with him a deep resentment for his absent parents, a sense of betrayal from his mother, and a growing talent for manipulation. He had learned early that love could be transactional, and that people could be controlled if you found their weakness. This dangerous combination of abandonment, rejection, and cunning would one day become the foundation for the cult leader he would transform into. As the 1940s drew to a close, Charles Manson was not yet the infamous figure he would become. At this stage, he was a neglected teenager, drifting between foster homes and reform schools, already forming a twisted worldview shaped by pain, loneliness, and survival. The boy who once begged for his mother's affection was slowly disappearing, replaced by a young man who trusted no one and relied only on manipulation to get by. The seeds of chaos had been planted, and soon they would grow into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, Charles Manson's life was already spiraling in a direction few teenagers could imagine. By the age of 13, he had become a familiar face in juvenile courts and reform schools. His early encounters with the justice system weren't just temporary punishments. They were training grounds where he sharpened the skills that would define his life: manipulation, deception, and survival at any cost. Manson's first reform school experience came at the Gibault School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. Sent there in 1947, Charles was just 12 years old. The institution, run by Catholic priests, was meant to instill discipline in troubled boys. Instead, it became a place of humiliation and abuse. Charles struggled to adapt to the rigid routines, and within 10 months he escaped. But life outside offered no comfort. His mother refused to take him back, and he quickly resorted to theft and street crime. Before long, he was caught again, and the cycle repeated itself. The young boy, who once longed for his mother's affection, now saw institutions as his only constant. At Gibault, and later at other reform schools, Manson learned to watch people closely. He observed their weaknesses, their fears, and their desires. He realized that controlling people wasn't always about physical strength. Sometimes it was about getting inside their heads. This realization would become central to his life's work. In 1948, at just 14 years old, Charles committed a more serious crime. He broke into a grocery store, stole money, and was arrested once again. The court sent him to the Boys Town facility in Omaha, Nebraska. Boys Town was famous at the time as a rehabilitation center for troubled youth. But for Charles, it was just another opportunity to manipulate his way through life. Within 4 days, he had convinced another boy to help him escape. Together, they stole a car and headed toward California. The trip didn't last long. Caught in Utah for driving a stolen vehicle across state lines, Charles faced federal charges. This time he was sent to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. Unlike his previous days, this was a far more secure facility, and here Manson was subjected to psychological evaluations. Doctors noted that he was illiterate, antisocial, and displayed an unusual need to control others. One psychiatrist described him as markedly aggressive, with a tendency toward passive manipulation. Another warned that Charles could become dangerous if left unchecked. Yet, even in this environment, Charles found ways to charm and deceive. He would often act polite and cooperative in front of staff, convincing them he was making progress. But behind the scenes, he continued to manipulate other boys, positioning himself as a leader among them. In 1951, Manson was transferred to the Natural Bridge Honor Camp, a minimum security facility in Virginia. At first, it seemed like a chance for him to turn his life around. But Charles had no intention of reforming. He escaped again, this time with 2 other boys, and committed a series of armed robberies on their way back to the Midwest. They were eventually captured in Peoria, Illinois, where Charles was sentenced to spend time at the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. At Petersburg, Charles's pattern of behavior continued. He struggled to follow rules, often getting into fights and breaking into other inmates' lockers. Reports from staff noted that he was untrustworthy, manipulative, and displayed no genuine remorse for his actions. Despite his small size, he was barely 5'2" and weighed less than 120 pounds. Charles used his cunning nature to survive among bigger, stronger boys. By 1952, he was moved again, this time to the Chillicothe Federal Reformatory in Ohio, a facility for more violent offenders. Here, Charles began to show signs of something deeper. While he continued to commit minor infractions, he also started studying people more carefully. He began experimenting with ways to influence others, often using fear, charm, or deception. Though still just a teenager, Manson was becoming a student of human behavior in the darkest possible way. When he was finally released in 1954, Charles was just shy of his 20th birthday. He had spent the majority of his adolescence in institutions, learning little about education or work, but everything about manipulation, control, and survival. His release didn't mean a fresh start. It simply meant he had more freedom to continue his path of crime. Charles returned briefly to live with relatives in West Virginia, but he quickly drifted back into petty theft and car stealing. Without guidance, stability, or a real support system, he was drawn to crime as his only reliable way of life. He began to view the outside world the same way he viewed reform schools, as a place where people could be used, controlled, or deceived to his advantage. By the mid-1950s, Manson had become a drifter, bouncing from city to city, state to state. His crimes grew from small thefts to larger schemes, often involving stolen cars and forged checks. Though he occasionally held odd jobs, he was never able or willing to settle into a normal life. Every attempt at stability ended in chaos, usually of his own making. But more than his crimes, it was his personality that stood out. People who encountered him during this period often described him as strangely magnetic. He could be soft-spoken one moment and manipulative the next. He had a way of making others believe he was harmless, even when he wasn't. This charm, mixed with his cunning, allowed him to slip in and out of people's lives, leaving trouble behind. Charles Manson's early years in reform schools and juvenile institutions shaped him into something far more dangerous than just a petty criminal. They stripped away any remaining innocence and replaced it with anger, distrust, and a need for control. He had entered these institutions as a neglected child, but he left them as a young man skilled in manipulation, hardened by abuse, and devoid of compassion. By the time he turned 21, Charles had already spent more than half his life in correctional facilities. The world outside didn't feel like freedom. It felt like an opportunity. And in his mind, the lessons he had learned about survival, deception, and control would guide him toward even darker paths. The stage was set for the next chapter of his life. The boy abandoned by his mother and rejected by society was now a young man determined to take what he wanted by any means necessary. And soon, his crimes would escalate beyond petty theft and into a lifestyle that would bring him infamy. By the mid-1950s, Charles Manson was no longer a lost teenager, but a young man already entrenched in a life of crime. At just 21 years old, he had spent most of his adolescence and early adulthood locked away in institutions. Rather than being reformed, he was becoming sharper, more cunning, and more committed to a life outside society's rules. In 1955, Charles married a waitress named Rosalie Jan Willis, a 19-year-old from West Virginia. At first, it seemed like he might be turning a corner. Rosalie came from a working-class family and believed she could give Charles the stability he never had. The two moved to California, where Manson promised to start fresh, but stability was never truly in his nature. Almost immediately, Charles slipped back into crime. He began stealing cars, forging checks, and drifting between odd jobs while his wife tried to keep their young marriage afloat. The birth of his first son, Charles Manson Jr., in 1956 might have been a wake-up call for most young fathers, but for Charles, it was little more than another burden. While Rosalie worked to provide, Manson fell deeper into crime. He was arrested again that year for driving a stolen vehicle across state lines, a federal offense that carried serious prison time. Sentenced to 3 years at Terminal Island Prison near Los Angeles, Charles entered yet another institution that would shape his future. At Terminal Island, Manson encountered hardened criminals, conmen, and hustlers. Unlike reform schools, this was a prison for adults, men who lived and breathed crime. But instead of being intimidated, Charles thrived in this environment. He studied others carefully, picking up tricks of manipulation, persuasion, and control. He watched how some prisoners used charm rather than violence to get what they wanted, and he began to refine his own methods. It was also during this time that Charles discovered something that would become central to his identity: music. Terminal Island had a small music program, and Manson began teaching himself to play the guitar. He idolized performers like Elvis Presley and the Beatles, believing that music could be his ticket to fame and influence. In his mind, songs were more than entertainment. They were a tool for control, a way to reach into people's emotions and shape how they felt. By the time he was released in 1958, Charles had served his time but hadn't reformed. Instead, he left prison with a new obsession: becoming a musician. His marriage, meanwhile, had fallen apart. Rosalie had moved on, tired of his lies and criminal lifestyle. For Charles, this was just another rejection that reinforced his belief that relationships were temporary and loyalty was an illusion. Still, Manson pressed forward. In 1959, he was arrested again, this time for forging checks. His charm, however, allowed him to avoid a long prison sentence. He convinced the court he was trying to support his family and was given probation. But predictably, he violated the terms within months and was sent back to prison. Over the next several years, Manson bounced between freedom and incarceration, each time returning to prison with a sharper understanding of manipulation and control. He began reading self-help books, psychology manuals, and even religious texts. Titles like How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie became part of his personal arsenal. He practiced persuasive speech, learning how to use tone rhythm and repetition to draw people in. During one prison term in the early 1960s, Charles met fellow inmates who introduced him to new ideas, Eastern philosophies, Scientology, and the growing counterculture movements of the time. He dabbled in all of them, never fully committing, but always learning. What struck him most was the idea that people were searching for meaning, guidance, and belonging. Manson recognized this as a weakness he could exploit. Meanwhile, his passion for music continued to grow. He spent countless hours writing songs, strumming his guitar, and imagining himself as the next big star. To Charles, music wasn't just about fame. It was about power. He believed that through music, he could spread his ideas, control emotions, and gather followers. His songs often carried strange, cryptic lyrics that hinted at darker themes, though he insisted they reflected his unique vision of the world. In 1961, Charles was sentenced to 10 years in prison for check forgery and pimping. During this time, he became even more deeply immersed in self-education. He read about hypnosis, experimented with controlling other inmates through suggestion, and practiced his ability to charm those around him. Guards noted that, while he was often a disciplinary problem, he had a way of persuading others to follow his lead. By the mid-1960s, America itself was changing rapidly. The counterculture revolution was in full swing. Hippies, free love, psychedelic drugs, and rock music were transforming the nation's youth. While Charles sat behind bars, he absorbed everything he could about this movement. He realized that once he was free, he could insert himself into this new world. Young people were searching for meaning, rejecting traditional authority, and experimenting with new lifestyles. To Manson, they looked like potential followers. In 1967, Charles was finally released from prison after serving nearly 7 years. He had spent more than half of his 2 years in institutions, but he didn't leave prison as a broken man. Instead, he emerged with a plan. He was a self-styled philosopher, a struggling musician, and most importantly, a manipulator who believed he could bend people to his will. Upon release, Charles asked his parole officer if he could stay in prison. It was a shocking request, but it revealed something profound. He didn't know how to live outside. The world on the outside was chaotic and unpredictable, and Charles had grown comfortable in the structure of prison life. Still, he was denied the request. He was free, but also unprepared. With his guitar in hand and a head full of ideas, Charles headed for San Francisco. The city was alive with the summer of love, a gathering of thousands of young people searching for peace, freedom, and spiritual awakening. For Charles Manson, it was the perfect stage. He had the charm, the music, and the manipulative skills to stand out in a world filled with wanderers and seekers. His years in prison had transformed him. He was no longer the abandoned boy or the petty thief. He was a man who had studied human weakness, practiced manipulation, and found in music a weapon more powerful than violence. And now, in the heart of America's counterculture movement, he was ready to use everything he had learned. The stage was set for the birth of the Manson family. When Charles Manson walked out of prison in March 1967, he was 32 years old. He had spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, cycling in and out of reform schools and prisons. To many, he seemed like a man who had wasted his life. But Manson saw himself differently. He believed that prison had prepared him, sharpened him, and taught him how to control people. And now, the world outside was transforming in ways that made it ripe for someone like him. America in 1967 was experiencing the height of the counterculture revolution. Young people, disillusioned with the rigid traditions of their parents, were seeking freedom, love, and spiritual awakening. They flocked to places like San Francisco, particularly the Haight-Ashbury district, where psychedelic drugs, free love, and anti-establishment ideals defined everyday life. It was here that Manson found himself upon release, and it was here that he discovered an environment perfectly suited for his brand of manipulation. At first, Manson was a stranger in this vibrant new world. He was older than most of the hippies on the streets and lacked the clean-cut, artistic charm of the young men who played guitars on corners or handed out flowers. But he carried something different, an aura of mystery, a sense of intensity that intrigued those searching for answers. He spoke in riddles, mixed fragments of philosophy with biblical references, and presented himself as a man who had unlocked hidden truths about life. For young people drifting without direction, his words carried weight. Manson quickly adapted to the Haight-Ashbury scene. With his guitar slung over his shoulder, he blended in among the musicians and free spirits. He would sit in parks or on street corners, playing songs he had written in prison. His voice was scratchy, his style unpolished, but his presence was compelling. People stopped to listen, not so much because of the music, but because of the strange charisma that surrounded him. He didn't just sing, he preached. And his words suggested that he understood something about the world others could not see. Drugs, particularly LSD and marijuana, played a central role in the counterculture movement, and Manson quickly recognized their power. He experimented with psychedelics himself, but more importantly, he used them to weaken the defenses of those around him. Under the influence, young men and women became more open to his ideas. He would guide their trips, speaking softly, weaving stories, and convincing them that he held the key to spiritual enlightenment. To those who were lost, his voice became a compass. One of Manson's greatest skills was identifying vulnerability. He could look at someone and sense their insecurities, fears, and desires. Young women who felt rejected by their families or misunderstood by society found comfort in his attention. He told them they were beautiful, special, and chosen. He offered the love and acceptance they were searching for, but always with strings attached. Slowly, he began to gather a small group of devoted followers, people who believed in his vision, whatever that vision happened to be. In Haight-Ashbury, Manson also began shaping his identity as more than a musician. He positioned himself as a teacher, a guru, and even a prophet. He mixed ideas from the Bible, Scientology, and Eastern religions with his own twisted philosophies. He told his followers that society's rules were meaningless, that love was the only law, and that by freeing themselves from materialism, they could achieve true happiness. But beneath these spiritual-sounding lessons was a man who craved control. Every teaching was designed to bind his followers closer to him. As his influence grew, Manson started attracting women in particular. His first core followers included Mary Brunner, a librarian from Wisconsin, and soon after, other young women drawn to his magnetic presence. They were captivated not just by his words, but by the sense of belonging he offered. He called them his family, a word that resonated deeply with those who had felt alienated from their real families. For Manson, It was the beginning of what would later become the infamous Manson family. Life in Haight, Ashbury wasn't all philosophy and music. The streets were crowded, dirty, and often dangerous. Many young runaways ended up homeless, addicted, or exploited. Manson offered an escape from that chaos, a tight-knit group that cared for one another, at least on the surface. He provided food, shelter, and companionship, but in return, he demanded loyalty. His followers began to see him not just as a friend, but as a leader, even a messiah. Meanwhile, Manson's dream of becoming a musician never left him. He believed his songs could change the world, and he told his followers that his music would one day spread his message far and wide. He pushed them to support his artistic ambitions, treating his pursuit of a music career as part of a spiritual mission. To his followers, his music wasn't just entertainment. It was prophecy. Throughout 1967, Manson's group grew slowly but steadily. He was not yet infamous, not yet feared. At this stage, he was simply another strange figure in a city filled with drifters and dreamers. But what set him apart was his ability to bind people together with words, drugs, and manipulation. Where others sought peace, he sought power. And while most saw San Francisco as a place of liberation, Manson saw it as fertile ground for control. By the end of the Summer of Love, Manson had already formed the foundation of what would become the Manson family. His small group followed him with devotion, abandoning their old lives and identities. They called him Charlie, but they also began to see him as more than human, someone with special insight, perhaps even divine purpose. What none of them knew was that beneath the calm voice, the music, and the promises of love, Charles Manson was laying the groundwork for something far darker. The man who once begged for affection as a child had transformed into a manipulator who craved absolute control. And soon, the family he was building would be tested in ways that would shock the world. The Summer of Love had brought Charles Manson to San Francisco, but the city was only the beginning. Ahead lay the desert, the ranches, and the apocalyptic visions that would drive him and his followers to violence. The cult of chaos was forming, and its leader was ready to lead them into the shadows. By 1968, Charles Manson's life had reached a dangerous crossroads. What began in San Francisco as a group of drifters bound together by drugs, free love, and music was slowly mutating into something darker. Manson, once a small-time criminal with dreams of stardom, was transforming into a self-proclaimed prophet. His words grew sharper, his demands more intense, and his visions increasingly apocalyptic. The man who had once strummed a guitar on the streets of Haight, Ashbury, was now preparing his followers for what he believed would be the end of the world. Music remained central to Manson's identity. He still clung to the belief that his songs were destined to bring him fame and influence. His chance seemed to come when he met Dennis Wilson, drummer for the Beach Boys. Wilson picked up two of Manson's female followers who were hitchhiking in Los Angeles, and soon, the entire Manson group was living in Wilson's mansion. For Charles, this was the break he had been waiting for. With Wilson's connections, he believed his music career would finally take off. At Wilson's house, Manson and his family lived lavishly. They enjoyed food, drugs, and the luxury of a celebrity lifestyle, all at Wilson's expense. In return, Charles entertained Wilson with his songs and philosophies. For a time, it looked like his dream of becoming a recording artist was within reach. Wilson introduced him to music producers, and Manson recorded demos of his songs. But despite his efforts, the industry wasn't impressed. His music lacked polish, his lyrics were strange, and his personality unnerved many in Hollywood. The breaking point came when the Beach Boys recorded one of Manson's songs, Cease to Exist, but altered the lyrics and released it under a different title, Never Learn Not to Love. Manson was furious. He saw this as a betrayal, proof that the industry would never recognize his genius. This rejection fueled his growing paranoia and resentment. If music would not give him power, he would find another way. Manson began shifting his focus from stardom to prophecy. He became obsessed with the idea of an impending apocalyptic race war. Drawing inspiration from the Book of Revelation, the teachings of Scientology, and his own twisted interpretations of popular culture, Manson told his followers that society was on the brink of collapse. He claimed that Black Americans would rise up against the white establishment in a violent revolution. However, he insisted that they were not prepared to lead and would need guidance. According to Manson, his family would survive the chaos, hide in the desert, and emerge as rulers of a new world. He called this prophecy Helter, Skelter, borrowing the title from a Beatles song on their White Album. To Manson, the Beatles were more than musicians. They were prophets, sending coded messages directly to him through their lyrics. He told his followers that the White Album predicted the coming apocalypse, and he was the chosen one to interpret its meaning. The family, now numbering in the dozens, absorbed his words as truth. They had abandoned their old lives, surrendered their identities, and given themselves fully to Manson's vision. Under the influence of LSD and constant indoctrination, they believed that Charlie was a messiah figure. His teachings blurred the line between love and violence, freedom and control. What had started as a communal lifestyle was now a cult, bound not by peace but by fear, obedience, and devotion to their leader. By 1968, the group had moved to the Spahn Ranch, an old movie set outside Los Angeles. The ranch, owned by an elderly man named George Spahn, provided the perfect setting for Manson's growing commune. The women of the family cared for Spahn, ensuring his cooperation, while the group lived rent-free on the sprawling property. Here, isolated from mainstream society, Manson had complete control. He dictated everything: what they ate, when they slept, how they thought, and who they loved. Life at Spahn Ranch was a mix of drugs, sex, and constant indoctrination. Manson often dosed his followers with LSD, then delivered long, rambling sermons about the coming apocalypse. He broke down their sense of individuality, convincing them that the outside world was corrupt and meaningless. He positioned himself as the only source of truth, the only one who could guide them to survival. For those desperate for belonging, his words were law. But Manson's paranoia was growing. His failed music career had convinced him that Hollywood was corrupt and out to get him. He began to see rejection as proof that he was destined for something greater, something beyond fame. He told his followers that Helter Skelter was coming soon and that they needed to prepare. He warned them that every event, every song, every headline was a sign pointing toward the inevitable collapse of society. As the months passed, Manson's teachings grew more violent. He began testing his followers' loyalty by asking them to commit small crimes, car thefts, break-ins, even assaults. He wanted to see who would obey without question. Each act of violence, no matter how small, tightened his grip on the family. Those who doubted him were ridiculed, shamed, or forced out. Those who stayed grew more fanatical. By 1969, Manson's vision had shifted from waiting for Helter Skelter to actively trying to start it. He believed that if the family committed acts of violence, society would blame black revolutionaries, igniting the race war he predicted. In his mind, murder was no longer a crime, it was a spark for the apocalypse. The rejection from the music industry, his growing paranoia, and his apocalyptic visions all merged into a dangerous ideology. Manson no longer wanted to be a musician or a prophet of peace. He wanted to be a leader of chaos, a man remembered for reshaping the world through destruction. At Spahn Ranch, the family members sat around campfires, listening to Charlie's haunting voice as he spoke of blood, revolution, and rebirth. They believed him when he said they were chosen, that they would survive when the world burned, and that their actions were part of a cosmic plan. What none of them fully understood was that Manson's personal failures had transformed into collective delusion. His bitterness, his paranoia, and his hunger for control had reached their peak, and soon he would push his family from philosophy to action. The stage was set for violence. The dream of music had died, and in its place, Charles Manson had embraced chaos. Helter Skelter was no longer a prophecy, it was a mission, and in the summer of 1969, the world would come to know his name in blood. By the summer of 1969, Charles Manson's apocalyptic prophecy of Helter Skelter had consumed him and his family. The once loose commune of drifters had transformed into a devoted cult, willing to follow their leader into darkness. Manson had convinced them that society's collapse was imminent and that their role was to ignite the chaos. The family's loyalty had been tested, and now it would be put into action in a way that shocked the world. The decision for murder did not come suddenly. For months, Manson had been escalating the rhetoric of violence at Spahn Ranch. He told his followers that the world was on the brink of revolution, and that blood needed to be spilled to set it in motion. When his music career collapsed and his dreams of fame evaporated, his frustration boiled into rage. To him, Hollywood had rejected his genius, so Hollywood itself became the stage for his vengeance. On the night of August 8, 1969, Charles Manson gathered a small group of his most loyal followers. Among them were Charles "Tex" Watson, a tall Texan who acted as Manson's right hand, Susan Atkins, one of his most devoted female followers, Patricia Krenwinkel, who had surrendered her old life completely to the family, and Linda Kasabian, a newcomer who was chosen because she had a valid driver's license. Manson told them to go to a house in Los Angeles and totally destroy everyone inside. The house he targeted was located at 150 Cielo Drive in the upscale Benedict Canyon neighborhood. Manson had been there before. It was once rented by music producer Terry Melcher, who had turned Manson down in his quest for a record deal. Though Melcher no longer lived there, Manson knew the address, and in his mind, it symbolized the rejection he could never forgive. That night, the four family members drove to the house. Linda Kasabian waited outside as a lookout, while Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel entered. Inside the home were five unsuspecting people: Sharon Tate, a 26-year-old actress, and the pregnant wife of director Roman Polanski, her friends Jay Sebring, a hairstylist Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer, and Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old visitor who happened to be leaving the property as the killers arrived. The brutality began instantly. Stephen Parent was the first victim, shot dead in his car by Tex Watson before he could escape. Inside the house, the horror unfolded in chaos. Watson, armed with a revolver and a knife, ordered the others to subdue the victims. What followed was a frenzy of violence. Jay Sebring tried to protect Sharon Tate, pleading for her safety, but he was shot and stabbed repeatedly. Abigail Folger attempted to flee into the yard, but was chased down by Patricia Krenwinkel and stabbed dozens of times. Wojciech Frykowski fought desperately against Susan Atkins and Tex Watson, but he too was overpowered, shot, and stabbed to death. In the end, Sharon Tate was left pleading for the life of her unborn child. She begged the killers to spare her, offering herself as a hostage until the baby was born. But Manson's followers showed no mercy. Susan Atkins and Tex Watson stabbed her repeatedly until she collapsed. Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, died on the floor of her home, her life and the life of her baby taken in an act of unimaginable cruelty. The killers scrawled messages on the walls in blood, including the word PIG, a reference to Manson's obsession with sparking a race war. To him, these murders were not random acts of violence, but symbolic gestures designed to confuse authorities and blame black revolutionaries for the crime. In reality, they were acts of rage carried out to satisfy Manson's twisted need for control and revenge. When the killers returned to Spahn Ranch, they told Manson what they had done. Instead of shock or remorse, he was pleased. In his mind, the murders had begun the chain reaction he believed was necessary for Helter Skelter. To his followers, this reaction confirmed his power. He had asked them to kill, and they had obeyed without question. News of the murders spread quickly. Hollywood, a community accustomed to glamour and luxury, was shaken to its core. The brutality, the randomness, and the sheer savagery terrified the city. Sharon Tate's fame, combined with her youth and pregnancy, made the crime even more horrifying. The headlines the next morning spoke of a nightmare that seemed impossible to explain. At the crime scene, detectives were stunned by the carnage. The house was covered in blood, the victims brutally mutilated. The word PIG smeared on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood sent chills through investigators. Yet, despite the horror, no immediate suspects were identified. The motive was unclear, the killings too senseless to fit any conventional explanation. For Manson, this was only the beginning. The Tate murders had been a test, a demonstration of his control and his ability to use his followers as instruments of chaos. But he was not finished. In his mind, one night of bloodshed was not enough to ignite Helter Skelter. The family would strike again. That night in August 1969 marked the point of no return for Charles Manson and his followers. They had crossed the line from delusion to mass murder. The man who had once been a failed musician was now the orchestrator of one of the most infamous crimes in American history. And yet, the bloodbath was not over. The following night, the family would unleash another wave of violence, one that would cement Manson's place as a name synonymous with terror. The world would never look at Charles Manson or the hippie counterculture the same way again. The morning after the Tate murders, Los Angeles was in shock. 5 lives had been taken in a frenzy of violence that defied comprehension. Newspapers carried grim headlines, and Hollywood's elite whispered in fear. Actors, directors, and musicians, people who lived in wealth and privilege, suddenly realized that even behind locked gates, they were not safe. But for Charles Manson, the killings were only the beginning. He believed the world had not yet heard the message of Helter Skelter. The blood of Sharon Tate and her friends was not enough to ignite the apocalypse he promised. In his mind, another act of savagery was required, another night of bloodshed that would spread terror and confusion. On the evening of August 9, 1969, just one day after the Tate murders, Manson personally took charge. Though he had not been inside the house on Cielo Drive, he wanted to ensure the next attack was carried out precisely as he envisioned. He gathered a new group of family members: Tex Watson, still his trusted enforcer, Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel, fresh from the Tate killings, Leslie Van Houten, a 19-year-old eager to prove her loyalty, and Linda Kasabian, once again chosen as driver. This time, Manson himself climbed into the car, leading the operation. They cruised through Los Angeles, searching for a target. Several homes were considered but dismissed. Manson wanted a place where the killings would feel both random and symbolic. Acts of violence that seemed without reason, creating panic across the city. Eventually, they arrived in the Los Feliz neighborhood, a quiet area far from Hollywood's glitz. Manson spotted a house he remembered, the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Leno LaBianca was a successful supermarket executive, and Rosemary owned a boutique clothing store. They lived comfortably but not extravagantly, representing middle-class stability. To Manson, they were perfect victims. Not celebrities, but ordinary people whose deaths would send a message that no one was safe. Manson and Tex Watson entered the home first. They surprised Leno LaBianca as he sat in his living room reading the newspaper. With a gun pointed at him, he was tied up quickly. Rosemary, returning from a shopping trip, was brought into the house and bound as well. Manson reassured them that they would not be harmed, that they were simply being robbed. But once the couple was secured, Manson left, ordering Tex, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten to finish the job. What followed was another night of unspeakable brutality. Tex Watson stabbed Leno LaBianca repeatedly with a bayonet, then used a carving fork to mutilate his body, leaving it protruding from his stomach. Patricia Krenwinkel carved the word "war" into his flesh. Rosemary LaBianca was attacked by Leslie Van Houten and Krenwinkel, each stabbing her dozens of times. The violence was frenzied, excessive, and fueled by Manson's command to leave something witchy. When the couple lay dead, the killers smeared messages across the walls in blood, echoing the previous night, words like D-H-T-O Pidge, yes, Russ, and the chilling phrase, Helter, Skelter, misspelled in their haste, were scrawled on the walls and refrigerator. These messages were designed to confuse investigators, to make the crimes appear politically motivated, and to push society toward the race war Manson had prophesied. Back at Spahn Ranch, Manson greeted his followers without remorse. To him, the LaBianca murders were another step toward chaos, proof that his family was fully committed. The killings were not about personal anger toward the victims. Manson had never met the LaBiancas. Instead, they were pawns in his twisted scheme, sacrificed to further his delusion of sparking a revolution. Meanwhile, the city of Los Angeles was unraveling. The Tate murders had already left Hollywood paralyzed with fear. Now, within 24 hours, another brutal double homicide had occurred, seemingly without connection. Police struggled to link the two crimes, failing at first to see the pattern. Different jurisdictions handled each case, and without immediate evidence, the dots remained unconnected. For the wealthy and famous, paranoia spread like wildfire. High-profile figures in film and music hired bodyguards, installed alarm systems, and fled the city. Rumors swirled that the murders were ritualistic, drug-related, or even the work of organized crime. No one could explain the brutality, and that uncertainty deepened the terror. Inside the family, however, Manson's grip tightened. The murders had crossed an irreversible line. Those who participated were now bound by blood to Manson's vision, unable to turn back. Even those who had doubts, like Linda Kasabian, remained trapped, fearful of disobedience and uncertain of their own safety if they resisted. For Leslie Van Houten, the LaBianca murders marked her full descent into darkness. At only 19 years old, she had been a bright, middle-class girl before meeting Manson. That night, she stabbed Rosemary LaBianca repeatedly, later admitting she felt like she had to prove her loyalty to Charlie. Like so many others in the family, her sense of morality had been completely consumed by Manson's ideology. The crime scene at the LaBianca home shocked investigators. The sheer savagery, combined with the strange writings in blood, suggested something more than simple murder. The phrases scrawled on the walls, along with the misspelled Helter Skelter, added an element of madness. Detectives struggled to make sense of it, unaware that the answers lay in the twisted mind of Charles Manson and the cult that worshipped him. For the victims' families, the grief was unbearable. Lino and Rosemary LaBianca were not celebrities, but they were respected members of their community. Their deaths sent a message that violence was not confined to Hollywood mansions. It could reach into ordinary homes, into neighborhoods once thought safe. As police worked tirelessly to solve the murders, the family continued their life at Spahn Ranch, insulated from the chaos they had created. To outsiders, they were hippies living off the land, but behind the facade, they were a cult led by a man who believed he was orchestrating the end of the world. Within days, suspicion around Spahn Ranch grew, not because of the murders, but because of other criminal activity. The family's car theft ring, drug deals, and reckless behavior attracted law enforcement's attention. Investigators were closing in, though they had yet to connect the commune to the horrors of August 8 and 9. The Tate and LaBianca murders had transformed Charles Manson from a failed musician into a symbol of terror. His followers had crossed the ultimate threshold of violence, acting not for personal gain, but for his prophecy. In just 2 nights, the world of Hollywood glamour and Los Angeles normalcy had been shattered. The public had no idea who was responsible. The police had no leads. But inside the family, Manson's prophecy felt closer than ever. Helter Skelter had begun, or so he claimed, and while the city mourned, the family waited for the chaos they believed would consume the world. In the wake of the Tate and LaBianca murders, Los Angeles was gripped by fear. The brutality of the killings, combined with the apparent randomness of the victims, left the city paralyzed. Wealthy neighborhoods turned into fortresses. Celebrities bought guns, hired bodyguards, and installed elaborate security systems. Rumors swirled through Hollywood. Some whispered of satanic cults, others of drug dealers seeking revenge. The police were under immense pressure to solve the crimes, but at first they had no answers. The investigation began with chaos. Different police jurisdictions handled the Tate and LaBianca cases separately. At first, they saw no connection. The Tate murders involved celebrities and Hollywood insiders, while the LaBiancas seemed to be ordinary victims in their suburban home. Yet the savagery of both crimes and the blood-soaked messages scrawled on the walls hinted at a larger, more sinister pattern. Detectives pored over the Tate crime scene. They found the word Piggy written in Sharon Tate's blood. They noted the frenzied violence, the number of stab wounds, the ropes around the victims' necks. But there were no fingerprints, no obvious suspects, and no clear motive. At the LaBianca home, the bizarre writings, Risi, D-E-H, Topigis, and Helter Skelter, added layers of confusion. Who was trying to send a message? And what did it mean? While police struggled, the Manson family carried on with life at Spahn Ranch. They laughed, played music, and used drugs as though nothing had happened. For Manson, the murders were proof of his power. He had commanded his followers to kill, and they had obeyed without hesitation. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Some members of the family were disturbed by the killings. Others feared the attention they had drawn. Still, Manson tightened his grip, demanding loyalty and reminding them that the outside world was the true enemy. Ironically, it was not the murders that first brought police to Spahn Ranch. Instead, it was stolen cars. By late August 1969, law enforcement had gathered enough evidence to raid the ranch on suspicion of auto theft. when officers stormed the property. They arrested dozens of family members, including Charles Manson himself. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the group might be dismantled, but because of poor paperwork, many of them, including Manson, were released. Still, the pressure on the family grew. In October 1969, another raid on the ranch resulted in more arrests, and this time, the family was not set free so easily. Investigators began questioning the members. Some of the younger followers cracked under interrogation, their stories inconsistent and riddled with nervousness. The breakthrough came not directly from police detectives, but from inside the system. Susan Atkins, one of the women who had participated in the Tate murders, was arrested on unrelated charges. While in jail, she began bragging to fellow inmates about what she and the family had done. She described in chilling detail how Sharon Tate had begged for her life, how blood had been smeared on the walls, and how they had acted under Manson's orders. These confessions soon reached the ears of authorities, linking the family to the crimes for the first time. Once the connection was made, the pieces fell into place. Detectives re-examined the evidence, tied together witness accounts, and began building a case. By late 1969, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Tex Watson were all charged with murder. The charges shocked the public. Few could believe that the shaggy, haired cult leader and his group of hippies were behind some of the most horrific crimes in American history. The arrests marked the beginning of the family's collapse. Behind bars, Manson's control began to weaken. Some followers, once fiercely loyal, started to question him. Others, still devoted, gathered outside the courthouse during hearings, shaving their heads and carving X into their foreheads to show solidarity. To the world, these displays were grotesque, further evidence of Manson's manipulative power. The legal system now had to grapple with how to prosecute not only the killers, but also the man who had ordered the murders. Manson had not wielded the knife or pulled the trigger in most cases. Instead, he had manipulated his followers into doing it for him. Could he still be held accountable as the mastermind? The prosecution argued yes, that his control was so absolute, his influence so commanding, that he was as guilty as if he had delivered the fatal blows himself. The media descended on the case, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. Charles Manson's name became a household word, his face a symbol of evil. The trial was still months away, but already the world saw him not as a failed musician or small-time criminal, but as the leader of a death cult that had turned ideology into murder. For the family members still at large, life grew increasingly unstable. Law enforcement pressure intensified, and public opinion turned against them. Some went underground, others drifted away. The days of freedom at Spahn Ranch were over. The illusion of a countercultural paradise had been shattered by blood and fear. By the end of 1969, Charles Manson's dream of Helter Skelter had crumbled. The apocalypse he promised never came. Instead, he and his followers were facing the full weight of the law. The family, once bound together by music, drugs, and devotion, was unraveling. What remained was a trail of death, fear, and broken lives. The investigation had exposed not only Manson's crimes, but also the vulnerability of a generation. In the late 1960s, the counterculture had promised peace, love, and freedom. But in the hands of Charles Manson, those ideals had been twisted into tools of control and violence. The very movement that claimed to reject authority had produced one of the most manipulative leaders of the era. As 1970 began, the stage was set for one of the most infamous trials in American history. The world would watch as Charles Manson and his followers faced justice. And for the first time, the smiling, singing cult leader, would be forced to confront the truth. His reign of manipulation was over, and the family was falling apart. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers began in June of 1970, and it quickly became one of the most sensational court cases in American history. The crimes themselves were horrific, but what captivated the public was the bizarre spectacle that unfolded inside the courtroom. Manson, already notorious, turned the proceedings into theater. His followers, still devoted, made sure the world never forgot his name. The defendants were Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. Tex Watson, arrested later in Texas, would be tried separately. From the very beginning, Manson refused to play by the rules. He disrupted hearings, shouted at the judge, and made wild declarations. His long hair, scruffy beard, and piercing stare turned him into a symbol of countercultural darkness. The women, once ordinary girls from suburban homes, appeared transformed. They shaved their heads, carved X's into their foreheads, and smiled eerily during testimony. Outside the courthouse, other family members camped on the sidewalks, singing songs, holding vigil, and carving the same X's into their own foreheads. To them, Manson was not a criminal but a messiah. To the public, it was chilling proof of his control. The prosecution's case, led by Vincent Bugliosi, focused not only on the murders but on Manson's manipulation. Bugliosi argued that Manson had created a cult in which his word was law, though he had not physically killed most of the victims. His influence was so absolute that he was guilty of orchestrating the crimes. The concept of murder by proxy became central to the case. Testimony from former family members revealed the extent of Manson's brainwashing. They described life at Spahn Ranch, the drug-fueled indoctrination sessions, and his obsession with Helter Skelter. They recounted how he convinced his followers that a race war was coming, and how the murders were designed to ignite it. Most shocking was the testimony about Sharon Tate's final moments, how she begged for the life of her unborn child and was shown no mercy. The defense attempted to portray Manson as a scapegoat, a man unfairly blamed for the actions of others. But Manson sabotaged his own case. He once leaped across the defense table in a failed attempt to attack the judge, forcing security to restrain him. He smiled and made cryptic remarks when evidence of the killings was presented. Every gesture reinforced the image of a man both dangerous and unrepentant. The trial lasted 9 months, at the time the longest murder trial in U.S. history. On January 25, 1971, the jury delivered its verdict guilty on all counts. Manson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten were convicted of 7 murders, including the killings at the Tate and LaBianca homes. In March, they were sentenced to death. For a time, it appeared that Manson and his followers would face the gas chamber. But in 1972, the California Supreme Court abolished the death penalty, and their sentences were automatically commuted to life in prison. This meant that Charles Manson would spend the rest of his days behind bars, his visions of Helter Skelter forever unrealized. In prison, Manson remained a figure of fascination. He gave erratic interviews, sometimes charming, sometimes terrifying. He carved a swastika into his forehead, reinforcing his image as a symbol of hate. He rambled about global conspiracies, environmental destruction, and his continued belief that he was a prophet. His words made little sense, yet his notoriety kept him in the public eye. Over the decades, Manson became less a man than a cultural icon of evil. Books, documentaries, and films dissected his life, his crimes, and his influence. Some saw him as the embodiment of the death of the 1960s, the moment when peace and love gave way to blood and madness. Others studied him as a case study in manipulation and cult psychology. The women of the family also remained in prison, though their paths diverged. Susan Atkins died in 2009 after decades behind bars. Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten remained incarcerated, occasionally seeking parole, but often denied due to the brutality of their crimes. Tex Watson, too, lived out his life in prison, becoming a born-again Christian, but never escaping his role as Manson's executioner. For the victims' families, the pain never faded. Each parole hearing reopened wounds. Each book, each film, each headline reminded them of the loved ones stolen in 1969. Sharon Tate's mother, Doris Tate, became a vocal advocate for victims' rights, ensuring that the voices of the murdered were never forgotten in the shadow of Manson's infamy. As the years passed, Manson aged, but never softened. He remained manipulative, often incoherent, but always unsettling. He denied responsibility, shifted blame, and embraced his image as a villain. To some fringe followers, he remained a messianic figure, but to most of the world, he was a reminder of how charisma and control could turn ordinary people into killers. On November 19, 2017, Charles Manson died in a California hospital at the age of 83. His death closed a chapter in American history, but did not end the fascination with his story. Even in death, his name carried weight, synonymous with manipulation, madness, and murder. The legacy of Charles Manson is not one of greatness, but of warning. He was a man who never achieved his dream of fame through music, yet achieved infamy through violence. He preyed on the vulnerable, exploited the disillusioned, and twisted the ideals of a generation to serve his ego. His story reminds us how dangerous the combination of charisma, paranoia, and blind devotion can be. From his troubled childhood to the blood-soaked nights of August 1969 to his decades in prison, Manson's life was a journey into darkness. He left behind not songs or art, but scars on his followers, on his victims' families, and on the culture of an entire nation. More than half a century later, the name Charles Manson still evokes fear. He remains a symbol of chaos, a reminder that evil can hide behind charm, that peace can be corrupted into violence, and that one man's delusion can destroy countless lives. His death ended his life, but his shadow endures, etched permanently into the history of crime and the collective memory of America.